I'm presenting on some work I've been doing on communicating climate change, and my talk is going to talk about the issues of framing and false dichotomies. And I'm kind of following up on one of the aspects that Karen talked about this morning on targeting, and specifically targeting behaviors and how we segment and look at energy conservation behaviors. So before we talk about these things, I want to make sure we're on the same page as to what these terms mean. So by framing, I'm referring to the presentation of information in a way that might highlight or not highlight certain parts of information. So one of my favorite, I do have my requisite cartoon, Skip. Garfield, who frames his height to weight ratio not as overweight but under tall, and there's lots of other ways we can frame $9.99 as focusing on the fact that it's less than $10, the glass is half full, trickle-down economy. There's lots of ways that we frame information. And dichotomy, by that term, I refer to a pair of categories that are both mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So much like these circles, within each circle, there's only black or white. Everything in that circle is either black or white, and that is a dichotomy. So we can think of, when we talk about energy conservation, we often talk in this black and white A or B way. We talk about things like supply and demand, adaptation, mitigation, acceptance, denial, whether or not something works. And although we know that they're not exactly black and white, we use this very often when we talk about a lot of things, but in our work. And there are benefits to simplicity. Simplicity serves a purpose, right? We want to convey information, the information that we want to, in as simple a way as possible. Sometimes when we give all the complexity and all the gray in climate, in energy conservation, people can just tune out. So there is a role for simplicity, but I think we need to be careful, because sometimes the simple answer isn't necessarily the right one, and it might not be the one that solves the problem that we're really trying to get at. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those. So one that's come up today, and you can see I have my little dichotomy marker, so you can count the dichotomies in here. I had fun finding them all. So one that we've talked about today is technological solutions versus behavioral solutions. Clearly, this is a behavioral conference, and we talk about the importance of behavior, not just efficiency or technology, but people use technology. There are solutions that integrate behavior and technology. One of the areas that I study is technology-enabled energy feedback. So we're not studying one or the other, but the integration of the two. And I think one really successful form of framing, a couple other people I think have mentioned today, Dietz et al., wrote a paper that talked about behavior serving not as an alternative to technological solutions, but as a wedge to get us short-term savings while we're waiting for newer technologies, regulations, some of these other things. So we don't have to choose from among these. We can look at them as complementary. So when we look, because this talk is about communicating and information, when we look at traditional media approaches, we see another little two-way, a little dichotomy between looking at energy conservation behaviors as kind of an aggregate, go green, be eco, save energy. Or we also see a lot of messaging looking at single behaviors, buy an Energy Star appliance, turn off lights when you leave a room. And there are clearly issues with both of these strategies. We know that conservation is not one but many behaviors, hundreds of behaviors just in the home alone. And we can look at segments, the different rooms or places that energy takes place, or even within one sector like lighting, we can distinguish between turning off lights when we leave a room or changing our light bulbs. So one possible, and when we think about all of these different behaviors, if we were just promoting them one at a time, we can see that people might get overwhelmed, turned off. And there's even research that, that people might engage in what's called a single action bias, where I change my light bulb, feel really good about myself, and then go buy a Diet Coke. Or I might even engage in a rebound effect, where I purchase energy efficient products or services and then use more of them. So one solution that we've seen a lot more of in the past decade is talking about energy conservation in terms of behavioral dimensions. So we can look at turning off lights and buying an energy-efficient light bulb as two different dimensions of energy behavior, and they're often referred to as curtailment and efficiency, and we've seen a lot of people talking about these two dimensions. So we can look at this level that's broader than individual behaviors, but smaller than just save. So this could be driving slower versus buying an efficient vehicle, or bundling up in the winter versus insulating our roofs. So, and there are some other proposed dimensions as well. Some people have talked about subdimensions of maybe management versus investment, high and low cost, and building envelope versus appliance behaviors. So we wanted to look at the data and see what's really going on. Can residential energy conservation behaviors be classified reliably into distinct categories? And we did that two ways. The first was looking at how people report, and the second I'll talk about was looking at the definitions themselves. And are there differences in what predict these dimensions? So we asked a series of questions. We asked about 8 specific behaviors. 3 of them were curtailment. 5 of them were efficiency. Within efficiency, we made sure we included those proposed subdimensions of investment versus management, high versus low cost, and building envelope versus appliance. We also asked a series of demographic and housing-related questions to look at these differences. This is our sample as compared to the 2010 census. This was a convenient sample, so much like this room, we were a little overrepresented in years of education and income. Otherwise, we're fairly representative as compared to 2010 census data. And then, here's my dichotomy marker. We also were looking at psychographic or psychological predictors. And a lot of people talk about what predicts energy conservation or pro-environmental behavior, or how can we best promote. And there are 2 commonly discussed models. These are kind of a rational model and a moral model. The rational model says that people will engage in behaviors when it's in their best interest. This is kind of a traditional neoclassical economic approach. Garrett Hardin talked about it in The Tragedy of the Commons, that people will engage in the behavior that best suits them. So to get people to engage in pro-environmental behavior, we need things to make that beneficial to the individual. The moral model says, no way, we're altruistic. We can be altruistic. We can appeal to values, norms, this deep ecology idea. It doesn't have to be just about maximizing utility for the individual. So we asked some questions to test both of these models. In the field of psychology, the theory of planned behavior is one of the more common ways of measuring the rational model. And then we looked at norms and environmental motivation, and the new ecological paradigm is a measure of ecological values to measure that model. So first, what did people do? So we looked at whether these behaviors clustered reliably. And if you just look at the percent reported, we actually don't see these bottom 3 are curtailment. We don't see significant differences between those two. Both the highest and the lowest reported behaviors are within the efficiency dimension. But when we looked at them, when we ran factor or primary component analysis, putting in those demographic and psychographic variables, we did see 2 primary components, one for efficiency and one for curtailment. And then when we looked at what predicted them, we saw that efficiency, these are bivariate correlations, were primarily correlated with our demographic variables. There was very little correlation with curtailment, just race. And if anybody wants to explain to me why race is correlated with curtailment, I would engage in that discussion afterwards. We're confused. But we did see really strong correlation with efficiency behaviors. And then when we look at our psychological variables, we see the psychological variables are much stronger in their correlation with curtailment behaviors and a lot less with efficiency. But these are all bivariate correlations, so we threw everything together in a regression model, and we wanted to see controlling for these multiple variables, which ones best predict curtailment or efficiency behavior. And so what you see here are just the significant predictors in the final model, with the ones in red or starred as the most significant. So we see on the efficiency side, the most predictive variable of whether someone will engage in efficiency behavior is home ownership. Now this makes sense when you think about solar panels and appliances, but remember the questions we asked included things like replacing light bulbs and checking your toilet for leaks. These are things that renters can do and would be in the economic interest of renters as well as homeowners. So that was actually a troubling finding to us from a prescriptive perspective. And then in curtailment, we see environmental motivations were the strongest predictors of curtailment behavior, which makes sense and when we think of the rhetoric of curtailment as curtailing, using less, doing less, this sense of entitlement that Susan was talking about, that might be correlated. We did see one variable, and only one was predictive of both, which was bill consciousness. So some implications are possibly that encouraging conservation may not be specific enough. There is some validity in this dimensional approach. We should be looking at rational and moral motivations, but there are still things to look at. Addressing barriers for renters, not just contextual, but also possible psychological ones are important. And feedback Of course, I study feedback, but the data says feedback might be a promising approach in promoting both curtailment and efficiency. But we were still a little concerned, and we wanted to look at the data. So we see these two were empirically validated based on self-report data, but they kind of draw this line, it appears, between suffering on one hand, because turning off your lights when you leave a room, let's be honest, it's awful, right? And spending on the other. And we wondered, is this it? Are we missing something? Is this really a true dichotomy? Is this the best way we should be framing these behaviors? We should be segmenting these behaviors. So we cleared the slate, and we looked to the literature, and we tried to find everyone who's ever defined these two behaviors, and we found 28 authors who talked about who defined energy conservation behaviors in terms of dimensions. And we found they used a lot of different words, terms. People like to make up their own words for things, at least academics do, right? But they all kind of fell under these two main categories. And the most frequently used terminology, especially in this century, were curtailment and efficiency. And we looked at not just what words they used, we also looked at the definitions. And we found a series of attributes that came up more and more. And so we found these 7 attributes. Cost, frequency, lifestyle. You can see people talked about curtailment is reversible. It involves a loss of amenities. It's low cost. It's repetitive. There might be less impact. Where we see efficiency, costs money. It's less frequent. It involves structure, purchasing. It lasts longer. And it's more rational. So we're seeing this rational moral here in the definitions as well. But it's not really that simple. We did notice some authors had said the distinctions aren't always clear, and we saw in the 80s and the early 90s people were saying, oh, it's not that simple. But in the past 20 years, there hasn't been a lot of people really looking more closely at this dichotomy. And even within them, the operational definitions vary. Some say curtailment is subconscious, it's habitual. Others say it's conscious, you have to remember to do it. Even for specific behaviors like caulking, some say it's a curtailment behavior, possibly because it's inexpensive. Others, it's an efficiency behavior because it requires a purchase or is infrequent. So when we look at these attributes, and let's just look at the 2 most frequently reported attributes, and let's run it through our dichotomy test. So the features of a dichotomy are exclusivity and exhaustivity. So what we see is a 2x2 matrix between cost and frequency. So we have low cost and high cost, infrequent and frequent. Curtailment behaviors are generally those defined as frequent and low cost, and efficiency as infrequent and high cost. But we have 2 missing cells here. One of them is filled in possibly by maintenance or management behaviors. These are behaviors that are low cost and infrequent. These could be best of both worlds behaviors. These could be things that renters could engage in, that people with limited incomes could engage in. And they don't require us to suffer like turning off lights when we leave a room, because that's awful. And some other people have said that too. There are other people that have proposed, but again, none in this century. Nobody's really been talking about this in a long time, and that's what happens with language and with dichotomies. We pick up steam and we just reuse these ideas without stopping to question them. I'm not sure if there are any high-cost frequent behaviors. I doubt we would want to target them. I can't think of any. I called Oprah. She hasn't returned my call back to let me know if there are, but they might not be the ones that we're looking at. So when we look at this third option, just this third, maintenance, we can see that we don't have to just drive slow, which is also, let's be honest, really hard to do. Or buy an efficient vehicle, we can maintain our vehicles. We can plug those holes in our walls as opposed to insulating or bundling up in the winter. And there might be more. There's more recent research really looking at these behaviors. One of the studies that I'm most excited to see come out, Marilyn Cornelius from Stanford and some of her colleagues have looked at running cluster analysis, and they collected over 500 behaviors and are looking at what other possible clusters or dimensions there might be. So finally, these may be a false dichotomy, but they're picking up steam, and I think we should really think about the use of these terms. We do see that they are predicted. So the general population, at least that we surveyed, curtailment was more predicted by environment, efficiency was more predicted by contextual variables. And it may emphasize the spending aspect of efficiency and the suffering aspect of curtailment, and that might not be what we want to do. We might be missing out on some of these high impact like management behaviors. And just in closing, I think words, this might seem kind of silly to spend so much time talking about these words, but words are powerful. They're incredibly powerful. And like one of my heroes, Spider-Man's Uncle Ben, said, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think we need to think about the power of words and how we use them when we communicate. Thanks so much.